My name is Michael Dunford. I'm Strategic Market Manager at Catalyst. This is another Catalyst Thought Leadership Series. This one co-hosted by MillerKnoll. We're really excited about this one. We've got Beyond Aesthetics, championing inclusive design in the workplace. And it's going to be an enlightening panel discussion. We've got experts from T-Mobile, JPC Architects, and MillerKnoll. And we're going to be diving into this vital topic because we think it's time that this goes beyond aesthetics and making spaces look beautiful, which is super important. But there's a lot of ways to create equitable experiences and settings for people. So today we hope to share some challenges that we might be bumping up against, but then strategies to deploy to overcome those, as well as some best practices in tackling this issue. And it's about time, yet it's the perfect time. So we are joined by Christina McFadden, Senior Manager, Portfolio Strategy and Future of Work at T-Mobile. We are joined by Jason Romine, Associate and Project Manager at JPC Architects, and Jason Rosenblatt, Senior Design Strategist at MillerKnoll. We've got two Jasons, and they both have a last name that starts with R, so we'll figure it out. We'll be fine. I do want you to introduce yourselves, if you don't mind, starting with Christina. And I know you're all humble, but talk yourself up a little bit because you have impressive, all of you have impressive backgrounds.
Hello, my name is Christina McFadden. I have been working on T-Mobile projects for 7 years. I've been with T-Mobile for 3 years. Most recently, as actually I have a new title, Michael, Senior Manager, including workplace design as of a couple of weeks ago. So super pertinent topic for me. I'm a trained interior designer, and I'm really excited to discuss with y'all.
Hello, I'm Jason Romine. I've been an architect for 23 years, and for the first 18 years, 17 years of that, I did K-12 school design in the Seattle area in the Pacific Northwest, focusing on everything from elementary school size projects all the way up to high schools. So upwards of $130, $140 million projects. About 5 years ago, I joined JPC and switched over to a more commercial interiors focused, and I've been focused on T-Mobile projects since then. So we've been working all across the country on call centers, on the regional business offices, and on kind of some small installation works as well. So really excited. I think T-Mobile is really a leader in this progressive industry, and it's been an honor to get to work with them.
Thank you. I'm the other Jason Rosenblatt. As Michael said, I'm a design strategist at MillerKnoll, and I've been at MillerKnoll for about 6.5 years. But if I turn the clock back, I began with an undergraduate degree in industrial design, so product design at IIT in Chicago. And I went from there and got a master's degree in architecture, so a big leap, and then spent most of my professional career before coming to MillerKnoll on the A&D side doing interior design. So it was interesting because I felt interior design was this great middle ground between product design, which is very personal and human scale, architecture, which is very much about the environment and space and light. And at this point in my career, I've kind of gone full circle. So now I'm back on the product side with MillerKnoll, and it's been a really interesting journey to see kind of every part of the design profession and what goes into building and architecture and spaces and product.
Thank you. Thank you all. And Christina, sorry for getting your title wrong already.
That was a joke.
Oh.
It's very new.
I'm very gullible. I didn't understand it. Okay, like we always do, let's start with some context to make sure we're on the same page. We're talking about the same things. And I'm going to start with you again, Christina. So what does inclusive design mean to you, and how does it influence the work you're doing right now?
I think inclusive design is really about putting people at the center of design. And, you know, people are different. Everyone's lived experience is different. And so, you know, when we think about inclusive design, we think about just really having a lot of I think of having a lot of diversity in design. In terms of, you know, how it relates to the work we're doing at T-Mobile, I think incorporating those design strategies into things like guidelines, which are ever evolving, is a really big piece of it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Jason, Romine, give us some context so we're on the same page.
Yeah, I agree with everything Christina said. I think to me, inclusive design is all about empathy. And it's really all about understanding and seeing people for where they are and who they are and embracing that. So I think, oftentimes when we talk about inclusion, we think about accessibility, we think about ambulatory needs. But I think as this topic has evolved over the last 5 to 10 years, it's really become about a holistic approach. So cultural relativism, how are we embracing diversity? How are we embracing people's language and their backgrounds? And so I think that thinking about this as a holistic approach is the way that we like to think about it at JPC, and I like to think about it as a designer as well.
All right, furniture nerd, how do you think about inclusive design?
So it has affected the way that I've evolved as a designer. One of the things that I think all designers and everybody that's in kind of related profession come to the creation of spaces with their own biases. And I think acknowledging that, facing that, and understanding that the places that we design and create are affecting people's lives and that they have experiences that are very different than us. And involving people who are affected by the places that we create in the design process, I think is critically important for us to be better designers and create better places. And I think really diving into inclusive design while being on the furniture side of the business has given me a new appreciation for what furniture and the role it has to play in the creation of spaces. And just as an example, imagine this space with no furniture. Imagine this entire building with no furniture. What is it that we as human beings would then even do in here? The furniture is what gives a space like this its purpose and defines it. And furniture, we're all sitting in it. We all interact with it. We're setting our drinks on it. It's the thing that kind of is the bond between us and the architecture. And again, really is the piece that helps us form relationships with other people. And then also the work that we do or our education in our schools and our comfort in our home. So.
Okay, thanks. Hold on to the mic for a minute because I do want to address this to you first. There's a reason we called this inclusive design and not universal. Can you give us some background around the difference between the two and what that means to you?
Sure. Universal design, which has been around since about the 80s, was started by an architect named Ron Mace. And he was in a wheelchair. He was at North Carolina State University in the architecture program and ran into all kinds of barriers. He couldn't get a dorm room because they weren't wheelchair accessible. He had difficulty accessing the architecture school, and he became very passionate and a pioneer. And there's a Universal Design Institute at North Carolina State University today that is kind of the foremost organization that's kind of advocating for universal design. And there's a specific set of structured principles when it comes to universal design. And because it was started by Ron, it began with a very architecture focus, also kind of landscape design. It's evolved to incorporate product design as well. But one of the things that I think differentiates inclusive design from universal design, and this is not to diminish the value of universal design, because I think it's incredibly valuable and will be for a long time. And one of the best examples of universal design is the OXO carrot peeler. That grip is one of the first products that came out that just changed an entire industry. And that's a great example. That's a design that's meant to be used by as broad a spectrum of people as possible. That's kind of this definition of universal. Inclusive design, I think, is a broader umbrella. It's not striving towards, and I don't think it's attempting to say that there's a one-size-fits-all solution like that. A lot of what inclusive design has to do with is providing choices and giving people some autonomy to choose either a particular product or a setting or environment, a place that they really feel like they belong and feel comfortable. Now, inclusive design also isn't just about addressing people with disabilities. It could be, like you were talking about, riding your bike to work. It could be about making spaces more accommodating for people who just ride their bikes to the office. That's it. It would be a form of inclusive design. I think it's also cultural and social, crosses demographics. It could be somebody who's a caregiver or taking care of elderly parents, or they have kids, and they have very different needs in terms of the kind of flexibility, especially work flexibility, or a place to go take a private phone call than maybe somebody who's not a caregiver at a particular time in their life. So I think that might be a good primer on the differences between the two.
Yeah. Anyone else have anything to add on that?
Yeah. I think so. One of the things that Jason talked about that reminded me is there's not really a checklist when it comes to inclusive design. I think this is something that is really on the design team and the owner side team to establish the culture, the needs, what are the challenges and problems that a project has. So as an architect or a designer, if somebody's coming to us, it's to solve something that is changing for them. That could be more square footage. That could be they want an update to their look and feel, but it also could be some cultural changes within their office or their space that they want to adapt. And so I think that's something that happens early on in the design process that's key as part of integrated design is that programming process and understanding the client, understanding what the needs are, understanding how they operate, how culturally do they work as a company. And so I think, oftentimes we can get stuck into the notion that this is a checklist thing that we need to go down and we're gonna kind of check down this, but it's really so intimate and tied back to the individual user group. And so I think that's something that's really whether that gets pinned in and established through question and answer sessions that can go out to that user group, or whether that gets established with a key component group that's been assigned to the project, that early stage of really establishing what is the problem that we're trying to solve, what are the challenges that we're trying to resolve is so critical, because ultimately we can design a beautiful space. I know we're going to talk about aesthetics probably later on, but we can design a beautiful space, but if that space doesn't anchor back into the true needs of the group that is going to occupy that space, it's not a successful project.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. All right, context set. I like it. We want to get to know you a little bit better before we move on. Christina, can you share a project you worked on or a personal example of something that profoundly influenced or experienced your experience around inclusive design?
Yes. I think most of you in this room probably know who Brian Collins is. He is not here himself, but when I think about projects that have really inspired me in this space, it's one of the latest Microsoft buildings, Building 6. If you've had a chance, you haven't had a chance to tour it. It's a really beautiful space. And there's two things in particular about that project that really made me think about how we do inclusive design at T-Mobile. One of them is the integration of technology, which is not surprising at Microsoft. Just thinking about the digital experience, wayfinding, the way that audio is used to help with wayfinding, that's just really exceptional. And the other is something so small, but so meaningful to me as a mother, which is in their restrooms, they have diaper changing stations. And, tying it back to this conversation around universal design versus inclusive design, thinking about the diversity of experiences of people and really designing to that. I just think it was a beautiful, beautiful example of that.
Anyone else have like a project or a personal experience that they want to share?
I'll tell a bit of a story. So I can talk a little bit about on a personal side how I got involved and inspired by this kind of inclusivity and the notion of it. So when I was very young, I had some severe speech issues, and so from probably 3 years old up until 7 years old, I went to a school that was special needs school, basically is what they would call it at the time. But it was most of the kids I was in school with had ambulatory challenges, so cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, and so really early on, I got to see the world through their perspective, and I was kind of the helper because I had ambulatory ability, and so I would push them around the wheelchairs and see the world through that framework. Move forward into when I was doing school design, I think that you're working with communities that have the best intent, and at times the process of working through how do we work with kids that have needs that are different than others. It was the notion of giving them a different experience due to efficiency. And so something that I recognized early on and fought hard for was the idea that all kids should experience school the same way. They should enter through the same door. They should feel like they're not coming through a back door, even if that is more efficient for bus circulation, those kinds of things. It's worth the extra 45 seconds or so to have a similar experience and have an inclusive experience. So we didn't call it inclusivity at the time, but that's really what we were talking about. That's really what we were kind of struggling with and figuring out how to make that situation be on an equal footing. For a project example, right down here on 8th Street, Northeast 8th, I did a project called Stevenson Elementary. And this goes back to this notion of inclusion and the diversity that comes with that term. So this is about cultural inclusion. So that school has the most diverse population in all of Bellevue. And in talking with and having those early programming conversations with students, with teachers, some of the children were really struggling with the idea of acceptance and feeling like they belonged and feeling like they were worthy. So as part of that programming conversation, we took the cultural core of that school, or we took the core of that school and turned it into a cultural center. So the art room, the music room, the makers lab, and also a community meeting area that parents would come to in the evening, get help with resumes, things like that. It was all centered around this center oculus. I don't know if anybody's been to that school, but it's all kind of centered around that center oculus, a 2-story space. And it wasn't something that was in our program that we were provided. We learned that information by talking, having conversations, and understanding the cultural significance of what the school was experiencing. So I think that project has been really impactful to me because we went to the grand opening to see the joy and the idea of being seen was so impactful to not only the students, but their parents as well. So that's a project that stuck with me and really has, I mentioned earlier, this idea of programming being so integral to understanding who are we designing to and what are we designing for. And I think that's a project that I would use as an example of that.
Thank you. That's great. So let's talk about some actual examples of what this looks like in practice. Christina, I'd want to pick on you again. I mean, what is inclusive design, the guiding principles around it? How does it actually manifest itself at T-Mobile in your spaces?
So I think there's a few different pieces here. So there's like the listening piece, there's the guidance and the standards and sort of all of those deliverables. And then for us, there's also like the communication. So for the listening piece, just going back to what you were saying about programming and really understanding the requirements, we have a really really strong accessibility ERG at T-Mobile, and they host monthly listening sessions with a bunch of different folks from different orgs at T-Mobile. And I've attended a few of those sessions, and it's an opportunity for all of the members of the ERG to talk about different challenges that they're having, some of them space challenges. And, it's not a solutioning session, right? It's a listening session. So that has been super helpful for me to start thinking about, what are the opportunities? And then we also have a workplace accommodations team that also sends us, information about employees that need a particular solution. Sometimes out of those conversations can come kind of more broad solutions that we want to implement across the portfolio. So, once we know what we need to solution for, then we work with our internal team, some of who are here, and think about, okay, how can we implement this? Oftentimes it's changing our guidelines to accommodate those solutions. And then I think the big piece, probably the most important piece for us right now, is how do we communicate that information? How do we communicate that to our project managers? How do we communicate that to our internal team? How do we communicate the importance? So making sure that things don't accidentally get, VE'd out of a project, like really, really bringing our internal team along with us, and then also bringing our external partners along with us. And then, being a champion and talking to the other organizations about the work that we're doing to be a more inclusive organization. I mean, it takes a lot of communication.
And just, I think everyone knows, but ERG, that's Employee Resource Group.
Yep.
Anyone else have, I mean, I know you all three do. Who wants to talk next? Who wants to?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about T-Mobile and just piggybacking on what Christina talked about. So I think a couple of things that I've witnessed working on T-Mobile projects for the last 5 years that I find unique is the celebration of employees that you guys do. I think that's a big part of creating community within a space. And they do an incredible job, especially on the call center side, where I've worked a lot on those projects. It's an amazing culture that they've carved out and created to celebrate each other, lift each other up. So I think that's something that's really special. And they have display areas where they're celebrating that within the building. And I think that's a big part of inclusiveness that I've seen on those projects. The other thing that the T-Mobile team has really pushed us for is regionality. So understanding, we've worked all over the country on T-Mobile projects. And the challenge to us has been, we shouldn't be able to take that project, pick it up and move it to another location and have it feel like it fits. It should be embedded in to the culture and the regionality of that space. And I think, one of the things that one of the pieces that comes along with that is material selection, but it's also understanding how those individual teams work together and what culturally makes sense in the region that they're in. I'll give a quick example on a T-Mobile project that I think it's a simple solution, but we talk about the ability to design to all senses. So we worked on a project in Colorado Springs where we had to carve out, and there was really no established core to the building. There was no center space, and it also needed to connect through to create a circulation space and have some wayfinding. So as part of our partie and our conceptual diagramming, we kind of figured out what areas do we want to cover, how do we want to wrap this area to really pull and connect through the space. As part of that process, and this goes back to inclusion, the idea of inclusion, we could have picked just a wall covering or an accent paint. We actually used a textured wood, and it was a species of wood that was native to Colorado. So it brought some of that regionality in, brought some of their mountain elements in, but also became a tactile and a sense experience for people that, not only for people that have vision needs or challenges, but also, there's scent involved in that because we selected a product that didn't need to be stained. It was heat treated. So we could leave it raw and natural. It had a beautiful smell that came off of it, just like being in a pine forest. So really experiencing and using the senses to allow people of all disabilities to experience the space, not just visually, but texturally, scent oriented, orally. So I think just kind of holistic experience and thinking about how do we use architecture to enhance the space and not feel like it's something that we're having to lean into and make this place inclusive. It should just be part of the architecture. And I think that was a discussion we had internally and with the T-Mobile team.
Jason Rosenblatt, yeah, give us some examples. How is this starting to come to life physically?
Yeah, and sorry for my disappearing act. I was getting a prop that I'm going to use here in a minute. I think
we missed you.
It was, I've been fortunate enough at Herman Miller to have worked on several projects that had inclusive design as a primary driving design principle. But I think one of the more interesting ones is the Harkin Center, and the Harkin Center houses the Tom and Ruth Harkin Institute. And Tom Harkin was an Iowa senator whose signature legislation was bringing to vote the American Disabilities Act in 1990. So he's very closely associated with that. His brother was deaf, and so he had a lot of personal experiences with his family of the kinds of barriers that exist with people that have disabilities. And so this has always been something very passionate for him. And after he retired, he and his wife started this institute. And the goal of the institute was to be an advocate and a public policy source for people that are looking for more information about universal and inclusive design and how to design better spaces for people with disabilities. So the Harkin Institute, which is on the Drake University campus in Des Moines, the architect was a local architect called BNIM. We partnered with them, and one of the things that was really nice was they invited us very early into the project. So we were at the table throughout all the early design phases and giving a point of view as to the role that furniture could play. And I thought that was critically important. Another thing that was critical was that both the architect and the Harkin Institute put together a disability advisory committee, which is about 30 individuals. And this was a group that would share their insights. And one of the first questions that was asked of this group was simply what barriers still exist, kind of despite the ADA. And they were answering that question for 2 years. I mean, just the project, ongoing, just so many of their experiences came to light that influenced the design of this project inside and out. And one of the things that I think I'm most proud of in terms of the contribution was the publication of a book on guidelines for inclusive design. And this is kind of a double-sided book, and the architect, they did most of the work here in terms of the graphic design and publication. Half of this is the story that went into the design of the building, and the other half is this guidebook on inclusive design. And it's divided into two sections, one on the building and the other on furniture and the role that furniture can play, kind of at given equal billing, which I thought was pretty fantastic. And this was meant to serve as both a set of guiding principles for this project, but also a resource for anybody. And so at the open house, they had posters all throughout the building, different pages from this book. Randomly go to one of them that have a particular inclusive design principle, and little poster would be at a location like that in the building. So it kind of tell the story all the way throughout, and we try to circulate this as much as possible, because again, this is meant to be something that helps.
And we will be sending a link to download the digital copy of this book afterwards, as well as a fantastic guidebook that JPC Architects put together too. So there's plenty of stuff to nerd out
There's
of.
stuff in Jason's guidebook that I'm absolutely stealing because it was fantastic, and I wish we'd had it in here.
So I'm a little curious about some of the hard things you all might be grappling with. are there objections you have to overcome, hurdles you have to cross? Like, why are we not just doing this for all projects? Christina, I want your perspective on this first.
So something that's really important to me is this idea of equity in workplace experience. So, it's really easy to have a really good workplace experience in your headquarters project where there's so much capital spent, so really, really big, beautiful spaces, lots of amenities. But something that is challenging for me and something that I'm thinking about a lot is how do we create a great workplace experience in our small field offices? How do we retrofit some of these solutions that are really important to creating an equitable, inclusive workplace experience? So, part of that is like having the visibility, getting out to the site, seeing it, understanding the needs of the employees who work there, which might be different than the employees in, your headquarters site. So it's complex, and it's not a one size all fits solution, right?
Yeah.
So that's something I've been thinking about a lot.
So, I mentioned earlier that we do projects all across the country, and when we work with T-Mobile, they're an incredibly progressive company, so this wouldn't apply to them. But oftentimes, these cultural conversations get into politically fraught territory, and I think that's a challenge. If I think about the most obvious one would be all gender restrooms, for example. That comes with political baggage. It comes with a lot of cultural items that come along with that. Spiritual rooms could be another example. And so figuring out how to have those discussions for the things that we believe in and we believe are critical for user comfort, user inclusion, and to have those conversations in a safe space and make it a safe space for others to express themselves. I think that's something that's challenging. And it's something that that we're still kind of working our way through. And I think that, oftentimes when we have conversations and we get pushback on things like that, it's you can take things, remove the cultural aspects of them at times and take it into a monetary discussion about worker health, worker productivity, retention, those kinds of things. And I think that's a way that you can navigate those conversations without, we're in a service industry, so we work for clients, but we also have values and beliefs of what we think good design is and what inclusive design is. So how to navigate that, I think, is an ongoing challenge, especially if you work outside of more progressive areas of the country.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like, we didn't talk about this in the pre-call. I didn't expect politics to come up, but it's a fascinating hurdle that you might overcome. I thought we were just going to talk about the cost of some of these things or the space required for some of them. But I mean, that's interesting.
That was my second. That was So the second point I was going to make is I think when you work with a company like T-Mobile, they have initiatives that they want to dedicate square footage to. And that's a very easy conversation, and it's being driven by the client. We do work with landlord based work where square footage is a premium, and every square foot that you can put a desk is a space that they can rent. And so how do we start to make an argument for some of these wellness spaces, for example, parents' rooms or spiritual rooms, quiet rooms that are to the benefit of employees? And I'm a firm believer in that, and studies have shown that, but it's taking away square footage. And so some of the things that we've been looking at as a design firm is how do we start to create flexible spaces that can be multi-use, allow that square footage to be used in a way that's rentable, but still give the service, if desired and needed, to some of these wellness spaces. And I think that's an ongoing challenge that we have outside of T-Mobile, obviously, but when we're driven more on the dollar side, when it comes to rentable square footage and leasable square footage.
Jason, what's a hard thing you're running up against right now?
So I'm going to say there are two. One is customers that don't want to engage with their employees, that they're afraid to ask them what they want. And I think it's usually asking the wrong question. And I don't think it's about asking them what they want. Again, kind of my example with Harkin and the Disability Committee, maybe the questions to ask are what are the barriers, or where are the places in the office that you maybe are feeling are excluded or get in the way of doing the things that you want to do. Those are the better questions to ask. The other challenge, and this is again, because I'm coming from the manufacturing side, the product side, that there's a perception that the relationship with the manufacturer is purely transactional. I buy your stuff and I install it, and that's it. And I think that's unfortunate, because when we are involved earlier in the process and we're part of that design team, and we can do mock-ups, and we could run workshops to try to understand better the types of settings and activities and tasks that people are doing and the relationships they have, we have a lot to contribute. I mean, just think of a company the size of MillerKnoll, the install base globally, and the number of customers and projects that a manufacturer at this scale has, and all of the insight that comes from those, the data that we collect. We have full-time researchers. There's a lot that I think we have to contribute if we can be involved early enough. In fact, one of the other ones, because my coworkers, Callie is over there with Tailored Studio, when we're involved early enough in the project and we uncover an unmet need and there's no product on the market that serves it, she's part of a group that does custom product development. And there have been plenty of projects that I've been on where I've been involved in these workshops with the customer, where we've uncovered the need for something that's not available. And if we're in there early enough, we could use our existing local suppliers and off-the-shelf products to be able to produce something uniquely tailored to a customer without costing what you might perceive would be an exorbitant expense for something custom.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like we want to make this sound like a commercial for bringing on MillerKnoll, but I mean, there is something to be said about bringing all of your partners together early and collaborating. And all the projects you're describing that were successful, they included that. So it totally makes sense. Yeah. I'm glad you said the thing about one of your challenges being your client doesn't want to listen to the groups or to ask the right questions. We've seen that a lot too, right? It's like designing. One of the things you talked about a lot, all of you, is this phrase of designing with, not for. And I see that still happening now. Like, we're designing in a bubble and we're not actually talking to those ERGs or the people that we're designing for. Christina, what?
I have a good story that's related
Ooh,
to this.
okay.
So we run a workplace experience survey every year at T-Mobile for all the employees. Just, we want to understand, how they work, where they work, what parts of the workplace are working for them, what isn't working for them. And this is a program that I took on last year. And at the time, we weren't yet surveying the CECs, just the back offices. And we were not asking an open-ended question, not one, because the feeling from the previous team had been, well, what if we ask something open-ended, then we're gonna open a can of worms, and we can't solve everyone's problems, which is fair. There's a lot of employees. But when we launched the CEC version, I said, let's ask the open-ended question. Let's just ask it and see. Maybe not even a lot of people respond. And the insights that we got by asking the question, so many great insights. We got a lot of insights about things that weren't working, that we knew weren't working. We got a lot of visibility into some things that we didn't know weren't working, that weren't working. And then we got a lot of really great feedback about what was working. So I think, don't be afraid to ask. I think that's the lesson for me.
So then how do you, I think you make a valid point, right? You ask that open-ended question and all of a sudden, I think the fear amongst, the owners are that they are going to get too much and then they're
Yeah.
going to get just people are going to be disappointed because I said that thing. Then how do you straddle that? How do you walk that line?
Well,
The prioritization.
I think being comfortable knowing that just because the individual employee is knowing that you're not going to be able to solve everything, I think getting comfortable with that
Yeah.
and just coming at that information with curiosity and an openness to try and fix some things.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's been a theme, which is listening to people, having empathy, surveying ERGs, and that is really interesting because we just aren't seeing that enough. So that could be one of the. I want to talk a little bit about some best practices or some things that organizations can do. If someone's in the audience, or we're going to blast this out afterwards, and they're like, "Where do I begin?" Where would you have them begin? Would it be talking to people? Would it be setting up guidelines?
Yeah.
So I know I'm repeating myself here, but I think having the user group or a committee that's devoted to that user group early on, bringing partners in, such as furniture, I think is a critical piece of that, and not being afraid of the answers you might get. And if it takes a different direction, the project a different direction, that's okay. And allowing flexibility in the system. Don't be rigorous in your design systems. Allow that flexibility, allow for input to come in and flex in that. Now, I think one of the things that there's two pieces of architecture and design. One is the rigid stuff that we're putting in the projects, so the hard architecture. Then there's a whole nother aspect, and it's the flexible pieces, the furniture, movable objects, lighting that we can change. All of those kind of customizable pieces allow for micro manipulations that minimize people's disruption. So I think one of the things that's really challenging is the diversity of neurodiversity, which is how do you have people that are part of a larger community, but give them the space to break away and have their own place of comfort, and so and still establish that in a community piece. I think that's one of the most challenging things, post 2020 that we're seeing. There's a desire for community, but there's also needs of the individual, and so balancing those two things out. So to answer your question, I think that by having the conversations, you can start to establish those things. For example, there's a lot of desire at engineering firms for individual workspace and breakout space, quiet time. It's been seen in studies across the board. So being aware of that and having those conversations so that we're incorporating the right programmatic elements, we're not just dumping a huge open office area, but we're having spaces that people can break out, have their quiet time. I think those are the kind of pieces as part of the design process that are key in establishing the needs that we're going to put into the project. We have a finite amount of square footage typically. How are we using that square footage? And what kind of flexibility can we build into the square footage that allows for manipulation on the micro level, but also the macro level? It allows them to potentially move walls or do those kinds of things. So I think square footage is a premium. A lot of companies are reducing their footprint right now. And I think maximizing the usage and the ability to flex into those spaces is going to be key going forward.
Yeah, God, we have so much I want to talk about because I want to bring up something real quick. Maybe we can talk about it quickly. It's one of these guiding principles that I'm reading a lot about, and specifically around the project MillerKnoll did with the Harkin Institute, is providing generous spaces and clear pathways. And that means more real estate. How are we wrapping our heads around that? Because it's gotten a little better since COVID, but it seems like densification and shrinking footprints was like the big thing. But yet now are we getting too tight? I mean, Rosenblatt, sorry, Jason Rosenblatt.
Yeah.
What do you think?
And I'll tie this to a phenomenon that we've seen post-COVID. And I think it's a shift towards not valuing presenteeism, when you're going to try to evaluate the productivity of a team or a group. you know, the idea of generous space fits so well with companies that are experiencing underutilized spaces in particular, which is just about any company that's not mandating a full-time return to the office. Also, I think generous space doesn't have to be square footage and efficiency. Sometimes it can just be making sure that there's one chair that's not at that table so that somebody in a wheelchair has a space to pull up and they don't have to move something out of the way. That's an example of generous space. So I think, or creating settings with at least two paths to enter and exit. Something that there's no bottlenecks, for example. A lot of that is just placement. It's not necessarily, we're going to make all of our corridors wider and everything's going to be 6 feet in between everything else. So I do think you can dial up and dial down the application of generous space as a principle, depending on the unique needs and what that customer has that they can really do.
Jason?
Yeah.
Romine?
I think one of the things that has really surprised me in the last 5 years is an appreciation for in-person space. And I think that in having conversations with tech companies, across the full spectrum of business companies, the culture that they built up over the years, once they went work from home, they saw a general deterioration of that culture over time, working from home. And I think it's really been interesting to see, especially on the tech side. I mentioned engineers earlier, they're much more isolationist typically as a group. Even those groups were really yearning for being back in person and were really driven to get back into the office. And so I think that we're still figuring out exactly where this is all going to land, to understand what are people needing, what are they desiring in the office. It goes back to all those conversations we're talking about. I think that's going to continue to lay out individually for companies. It's also going to start to lay out corporate wide. But I think that understanding where the sweet spot is for the ability for people to gather, to share ideas, to build culture, I think we've all seen that is incredibly challenging to do it remotely, exclusively. So that's been a really welcome surprise. It gives me solace in what we all do. We're in the construction industry, whether it's coming from the furniture side, the owner side, or the design side. We're building space because we believe that brings people together. And one of the silver linings of a post-COVID world to me is validity in that view. And that's coming out of surveys we're seeing. It's coming out of studies that are showing that people are more effective in person, but more importantly, they build culture and idea workshops are much more valid in person. There's all those kind of soft moments that you have at the water cooler, at the coffee machine. That's where a lot of the driving ideas come from. And so you could do your task-oriented things and you can work remotely, and we've seen effectiveness on that. But how do you build culture and how do you build community? And I think that it's going to be those it's going to be those group spaces in buildings that are really going to drive that. So I think we're starting to see a shift back toward companies appreciating that and understanding why are they paying for the square footage? What does it do for them? And understand that it does affect their culture. It affects their ability to do their work.
Well, and if you're asking someone to come back, you better design it in an inclusive fashion so that it makes them feel like they belong there when they come. Yeah. Last quick question, and then we'll do some Q&A. If you could say anything to a skeptic, someone that's like, no, we're just going to design to ADA and we're not going to go beyond, and we're going to just, what would you say to them in terms of why this is important and what they should, where they should stick it?
I'll take that one.
Not like I'm leading the witness here, but
at some point in our lives, all of us are going to have some kind of disability. I could break my leg and be on crutches. I could have a bad day and I'm dealing with a lot of stress or depression or anxiety. I mentioned the example before, as we get older, like I am, we start to become caregivers to our parents, and that has puts certain constraints on our lives. I could come back and get my eyes checked. My pupils are dilated and I got to wear sunglasses and sign so my vision is impaired. So I would say that to say, oh, we're just going to stick with ADA as kind of the minimum and something that addresses average, I would come back and make it personal. Again, we are all at some point in our lives going to experience feeling like the space is not accommodating us. And there's something that's in our way or we're excluded, even if it's temporary.
I want everyone to answer that one.
I want to be saucy here, but maybe I won't.
We want you to be saucy too, but I mean, you do what you got to do.
You know, I would ask, do we really want to design like to the minimum? Like, is that really what we want to do? That would, I guess, be my question back. I think that ADA is the minimum required, and that does not account for the many, many different experiences that we should be designing for.
Like that.
Yeah, I think ADA is really about life safety, and it's about ability for people to access things, but it's not about how we experience space. And I'll give an example. We talked earlier about making sure that people have balanced opportunities so that they don't feel like they're excluded, like they're cast into a side area. I think, as we're looking at the number of accessible seats in an auditorium, for example, we could just group all those right in one area, and that becomes the area for people with disabilities. Or we could make that much more of an inclusive experience. We can start to distribute that. That's just an example. So I think, when we're talking to clients, we're talking about humanity, and we're talking about how we all experience the world, and how do we want to be seen, and what kind of empathy do we have for others. And I think that drives us to go beyond just a code-centered ADA or IBC requirement level. And ultimately, it comes back, if we want to be hard-nosed with the facts and the dollars, happy employees are productive employees. And if people want to be bottom line driven, I'm personally not. I'm more of a humanist. But if people want to be bottom line driven and that's the motivation they have, it makes business sense to have happy employees, to have included people that feel like they are included in a larger whole and are committed to a larger organization. So I think if the humanistic side isn't resonating, maybe the dollars will. But I think that we're in this profession because we care and we believe that buildings in the built environment impact people's lives. And so we're going to continue to push for the betterment of those lives inside space.
Well said. Do we have any questions in the audience? Raise your hand and maybe we can, we'll just talk loud.
I have a question.
Yes, Aaron.
Can any of you guys speak to education that follows the building of these spaces for the communities that are going to use them? And because often I've seen spaces get built and then people don't actually know that they're in an inclusive space. And how do you communicate it and both foster a culture that allows people to feel good about using it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take that one. So this has been a challenge and an opportunity for us, big time. I think the easy answer is signage, right? You put up signage that talks about how to use the space. We had a lounge space in one of our buildings that wasn't getting utilized very much. And so we decided to create a quiet zone. And so we worked to change out some of the furniture to have, a few different settings where people could come and do focus work. And a part of that project was putting up a lot of signage around how to use the space, when to use the space, when not to use the space, which helped quite a bit. And I think, what we have done that in some of our other spaces, I think we could do it more. I think it's really great to go into a conference room or a focus room or, you know, any other space type and have like a little cheat sheet for how to use it. Like I love that kind of signage, and I think it's really successful.
Any other questions? Is Janine?
Christina, could you share an example from the employee survey of some changes you didn't know about that you incorporated?
So this is specifically about our CECs, is where we did the open-ended question. And there was a lot of feedback about noise, all kinds of noise, like HVAC noise, like the typical noise, and then like team celebration noise and music and so something that we've been talking about internally, although this is not yet something that we have actually implemented, is creating different zones for different pods, louder pods, quieter pods, because at a call center, you can't make rules about how people celebrate and then expect everyone to adhere to the rules, right? So you kind of have to think more strategically about it. So that's one example of something that we've been considering.
Awesome. Any other questions? Yes. Hi, Jana.
You. So going back to the conversations around the objection that you often come across. In my experiences, the number one objection that we see in companies being able to make change is because their executive leadership team isn't bought into the concept, because oftentimes they want measurable results around what are we going to actually gain? How are we measuring, and what is that gain? What's your advice to everyone in the room for how to approach that conversation with an executive leadership team? And then two, how can we measure results from this?
That's a great question. And that was one of our questions.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a big
How do you
question.
measure?
Yeah, so I was thinking with some of the other questions we're going through about kind of those early stages of development we talked about, and I think we've established that having early team collaboration is critical. Understanding what the needs of the employees are is critical. I think something I left out that's really important, I'll give a quick story about this, is when I was doing K-12 school design for Bellevue School District, we would have these charrette sessions, we would have these understanding sessions, and it wasn't landing. And what we kept getting the feedback on was, this is how we want to tweak our classroom. This is how we want to tweak our space. And we kept going back and saying, you don't have to, we're not tweaking your classroom. This is all new. This is a new experience. So something that was hugely beneficial, and I think if this can be integrated into those early design sessions, was to do tours. And we did tours of schools, but we also did tours of Google and Microsoft, so that the staff, the employees, the leadership could see the things that we're talking about. What does that look like? We could show all the photos in the world, but to see it implemented and see what it felt like to have breakout space or overflow spaces, things like that, was critical in getting buy-in on the leadership level. I think that the challenging one that is, how do you quantify this? Because I think a lot of the things we're talking about are unquantifiable. The things that are quantifiable are around dollars and cents typically. So I think there are plenty of studies out there that show the impacts of daylighting, the impacts of integrated design and how that helps employee productivity, how it helps employee retention. But how do you quantify that in your individual space before it's built? I think that's a real challenge. I think what I would guide toward are case studies that showcase the before and after of respective types of businesses to the business that you're talking about.
Thank, that was great.
Give it up for our panelists, Christina, Jason, and Jason.